Controversy in Japan as the government announces plans to release treated radioactive water into the ocean from the site of one of the world's biggest nuclear disasters. Hello, I'm Mike Walter sitting in for Anna Naidu, and this is The Heat. Japan is facing international criticism over plans to release more than 1 million tons of contaminated water into the Pacific Ocean from the Fukushima nuclear power plant. The plant was crippled during a tsunami back in 2011 and is being decommissioned. Prime Minister Yoshihide Suga says the move is the only way to help the area recover. But environmental groups and Japan's international neighbors say the action is irresponsible and unjustified. Phoebe Amoroso has more from Tokyo.
It's more than 10 years since this devastating tsunami killed 18,000 people and triggered a meltdown at a nuclear power plant on Japan's east coast. Since then, more than 1 million tons of contaminated water has accumulated at the plant. It's being stored in 1,000 giant tanks, but they're due to fill up next year. The plant's operator, Tokyo Electric Power, says it can't make progress on nuclear decommissioning if it has to keep building more tanks. They're treating the water to remove as much radioactivity as possible in line with national safety standards, and then plan to release it into the sea.
We will make sure to secure the safety level far above the regulation standards, and the government will put all its effort into measures against the spread of unfounded harmful rumors.
The government says the process will begin in 2 years, but take decades to complete. The plan has the backing of the International Atomic Energy Agency, but is facing condemnation from Japanese environmental and fishing groups and the wider public.
I thought they must be joking. The Japanese government must be out of their minds to make such a decision.
Japan is also receiving criticism from its international neighbours.
We plan to call for the transparent disclosure and international verification of the overall treatment process of the contaminated water.
Despite doubts and opposition from home and abroad, Japan has unilaterally decided to release the Fukushima nuclear wastewater into the sea before exhausting all safe ways of disposal and without fully consulting with neighbouring countries and the international community.
The move also risks creating negative publicity for Japan ahead of the Olympics. The Games are just 3 months away, and some events are scheduled to be held only 60 kilometers from the power plant. Last month, Japanese athletes carried the Olympic torch through Fukushima in a show of support for the region. The Games are being dubbed the Recovery Olympics here, but with organisers also facing a rising number of COVID-19 infections, there are concerns the latest plans for the power plant will further dampen the recovery spirit. Phoebe Amoroso for CGTN in Tokyo.
There's a lot to talk about, so let's get right to our panel. Changhua Wu is a policy analyst and executive director of the Professional Association for China's Environment. Sweta Chakraborty is a risk and behavioral scientist. She focuses on the implications and solutions to issues that threaten human security. Eunjung Lim specializes in East Asia as an associate professor at Kongju National University, and Hiroki Takeuchi serves as the director of Southern Methodist University's Sun and Star program on Japan and East Asia. And Hiroki, why don't I start with you? It's been 10 years, as Phoebe pointed out in her package, since the tsunami, earthquake, and the disaster there. We saw core meltdowns in 3 nuclear reactors. And ever since, there's been kind of this invisible obstacle, this contamination issue, which has just kind of hung over the region and really stood in the way of any kind of economic reconstruction. And that's what the Prime Minister is talking about. He says releasing these treated radioactive water is the only way for the area to recover. The plant will be decommissioned, but talk to us about the lingering impacts of all of this. What's been the impact economically, psychologically, not just on the Fukushima region, but Japan as a whole?
I think this is mainly psychological impact is huge. So if they release the water at this timing, then this is not popular in domestically, and then also, of course, very unpopular internationally. And then, the reputational impact. of especially the seafood, fish from that region, the Tohoku region, the whole Tohoku region, will have will receive a negative impact of this water release.
We'll dig a little deeper into that later in the broadcast, but Sweta, I want to ask you, there's a lot made about the safety of releasing this 1 million tons of specially treated radioactive water into the Pacific Ocean. It's not going to start for another 2 years. Let's listen to what the Prime Minister had to say about all of this earlier this week.
We have had an advisory panel study this issue for more than 6 years and received a report in February last year that releasing the treated water into the ocean was more realistic than other options. The International Atomic Energy Agency also supports this plan as scientifically reasonable.
Now, the government and the plant operators say that they can't get rid of the tritium from the water. It can be reduced so it's not harmful in small amounts. Other byproducts rather, can be reduced to permissible levels. But they're calling this treated, not radioactive water. Although that some people are saying, there's still contamination there. Is this a legitimate concern for some of these folks?
We have to remember that we live in an environment that always has toxicity in it to some extent, but we know what the levels are that are dangerous to human health. So if the water is treated and diluted so that the radioactive hydrogen isotope tritium is actually in there to a level that isn't harmful to the environment, to the aquatic ecosystem, and to humans, and that has been acceptable by an independent advisory committee, then as far as I'm concerned, the level of toxicology that we have begun to understand as a global science community is beyond anything we've ever experienced in the history of our human health. We can detect any sort of toxic materials in our environment to from parts per million to now parts per billion. So once that is signed off on by the scientific community, this really isn't of concern to human health in the way that it's being made out to be.
Changhua Wu, despite what Sweta just said, you've got Russia, South Korea, China expressing serious concerns about this, what it might do to the water, the ocean, and to people's livelihoods and food safety. South Korea is looking to take this case possibly to the International Tribunal for the Law of the Sea. Beijing's calling Japan's action extremely irresponsible, yet U.S. Secretary of State Anthony Blinken tweeted out his thoughts on all of this. He said, we thank Japan for its transparent efforts in its decision to dispose of the treated water from the site. We look forward to the government of Japan's continued cooperation with the IAEA. The United States says Japan's being transparent, but the Chinese Foreign Ministry has a different take on how they view the U.S. response. Let's listen.
The United States has always paid attention to environmental issues. We hope that when it comes to real environmental issues, the U.S. can focus on the issue instead of on individual countries, and not put the attention in quotation marks.
So give me your take on how China sees this and the U.S. response.
This is another sort of unfortunate case that's being turned into geopolitics and also a typical showcase of double standards from the U.S. side. As we all know, as more data information being released more and more in the last couple of weeks with this particular situation, we know there's a tremendous risk, and there is also not adequate transparency to the international community at all. But the U.S. government, coming out saying there is enough transparency, appreciating the transparency disclosure from the Japanese government. That's so ridiculous. The other thing I think, the biggest challenge so far probably is this lack of trust and credibility issue, right? And so who should be the final judge about this decision, right? Who we should listen to? As we all know so far, Japanese government, the operating company, Japan Electric Power, even as IAEA, they do not really have the level of credibility or trust actually from not only people within the country, but also from global community. So China has made a statement very clearly and very strongly, and very important, I think we need to call for immediate actions of all key stakeholders coming together to have a discussion, a dialogue, and come up with a solution rather than leaving everything to the Japanese government.
So who would be the trusted voice here, do you think?
Interesting enough, in the last few days, actually, in the media debates I've been part of with, For instance, Greenpeace, it seems to enjoy much more, credibility, more trustworthy than the key players I just mentioned here. So we do need to bring together not only from UN level, but really also from the scientific community, rather than leaving it to this number of panels put together by the Japanese government in the last 7 years as the foundation to support the Prime Minister's decision. That's just ridiculous, not very responsible at all.
Eunjung, this has created a storm of controversy also online, social media chiming in. I was looking at some of the responses here. Fukushima water could destroy half the Pacific Ocean in 57 days. That's what somebody posted. Others calling for a boycott of Japanese seafood. What is the likely political and economic fallout from all of this?
Well, especially for South Korean people, because South Korea, if you think about the geographic proximity between Japan and South Korea, we're very much anxious about any unexpected or expected side effects of the release if it's really done. Again, the fishery industry, absolutely, they are concerned about their own reputation or the food safety issue. And another thing I would like to actually add is, again, all this kind of style of communication of the Japanese government. Scientifically speaking, I'm not really the right person who can talk about the scientific cause or effect because I'm not a scientist. But as a person who studies international relations, international politics, all this, their manner, gesture, attitudes are pretty much, to be very honest, it's not that appropriate, I think. It looks like as long as Japanese government, they can persuade the Washington White House, if so, it looks like they are okay, right? Or if they can earn some kind of acknowledgement from the IAEA, it's going to be okay. So that kind of attitude is really, how would you say, adding another frictions to the already chilled relations between Korea and Japan, which is really concern to me. Mm-hmm.
Well, let me ask you about that. I mean, it's not just its neighbors, it's the court of public opinion. What should they have done differently? What can they do now to kind of massage things? Are there things they can do?
Well, at least I think the Japanese government need to show some more apologetic attitude, because obviously this is not our fault. Again, Fukushima disaster, I visited the site a few years ago. I know it was a natural disaster, which was simply just overwhelming. And I do know TEPCO and many other people, they really work hard to deal with these difficult situations. But, their attitudes, for example, Deputy Prime Minister Asotaro, he says China, Korea, their opinion doesn't matter to us. That kind of, again, the comments, remarks, is really adding another burden to the issue, I think, which is already difficult. Mm-hmm.
Sweta, you were talking about the science is there. The history is also there. And when you look at our history and as being stewards of the ocean, it's not a very good one. I mean, you go back to the 1940s, the U.S. had the Operation Crossroads in the Marshall Islands. They had 67 nuclear blasts, left the area, the most contaminated area in the planet. We also see cruise lines dumping pollution in the ocean. We see, 8 million tons of plastic dump in the ocean each year. So when you hear a government saying this is safe, a lot of environmentalists naturally recoil and they say, wait a minute, we've heard that before. What do you say to those people who are concerned?
I mean, you just hit the nail on the head. That's exactly what this is. This is a perception issue, not an actual safety issue. The safety is negligible as in terms of actually causing any sort of increased harm to human health in absolute terms. And so therefore, we need to deal with the perception of this. And the fact that here's another nuclear incident that is making its way through the news media and getting amplified through environmental groups and those that are concerned, rightly so, like fishermen, of the perception around different catches that are their economic livelihoods that will be interrupted because of the negative perceptions around not just this particular incident and how it's being handled by governments that aren't historically trusted because of the history of incidents that you just described, suggests that we need to really really hit this head on and adjust for the perception, the negative perceptions, because ultimately there are bigger issues that we are not paying attention to. And that is the role of nuclear energy in transitioning us globally to renewable energy, which is critical to stave us off this trajectory on a runaway, rapidly warming planet. And if we don't focus on the benefits of nuclear energy and the role that it's playing in this transition, and instead focus on the negative incidents that we highlight every time something like this comes up, we're really doing a disservice to our global collective humanity.
Changhua Wu, let me ask a follow-up just based on what Sweta was talking about, because I was reading where Greenpeace, you know, they have scientists who are really kind of nervous about this, and they say that part of the problem is Japan's saying this is safe, but they're basing this on dose models that are about single discharges, and this will be multiple discharges, and that's why they have concerns. Can you talk to us about that?
Sure. I think currently most of the attention has been focused around this tritium issue, right? This hydrogen isotope issue there. But in reality, there are 62 radionuclides actually in the wastewater that need to be treated. And many of them cannot be treated diluted to the level, to the surface level at all. So they are posing literally the risks actually to marine life and also potentially getting into the food chain to impact human health as well. From the solution perspective, there are solutions on the table. And one in the early on when the disaster happened, American company called Purolite, based in Pennsylvania, was involved in the process of piloting solutions. One particular technology that used ion exchange and some innovative, processing application techniques that could manage actually to dilute or address this, the radionuclides to non-detector level. But it costs much more, right? And also it's an American company. So from technology perspective, we know there are better solutions that the Japanese government should have deployed. In the meantime, actually, there are suggestions from Greenpeace and many others, basically saying you need to expand, the storage space and build about maybe more tanks and to store, to extend actually the decaying life for those radionuclides in order to reduce to minimal level of the negative impacts. So there are two options on the table immediately. So from that perspective, as I said, we know there are solutions available. It's not an exhausted decision by the Prime Minister of Japan at this moment, and rather they took the shortcut and they wanted to move forward actually with a decision that's going to harm the ecosystem and also creating tremendous threat and disruption to the global community, global environmental governance.
And Hiroki, there's the perception issue, which of course is hurting local fishermen in Japan. You touched on this already. The fish catches down dramatically after the accident, and now they've spent like a decade building up their reputation, and they feel like that could be erased overnight with concerns from the public. Talk to us about their concerns.
So their concern is they felt they were abandoned by the government in the last decade. They have so their reputation of the seafood from Fukushima and Tohoku area went down, and then actually even after 3 years after the nuclear disaster. And then the government declared that basically radiation level, everything was back to the pre-disaster level. And then still the fishing seafood from Fukushima area was significantly less expensive. So they have to endure the lower price. So that's actually a reputation effect. And then if this happens this time, and then the fishery industry really worries that, they actually, same thing may happen again. They were rebuilding their reputation, but this may have a tremendous, significant negative impact on their effort to rebuild the reputation. I think that's actually what Japanese people worry most about in this case.
Well, and let's talk about the Japanese people, because polling shows a little over a majority of the people are not in favor of this. And the plant operators have their problems. They had this internal report in 2008 that said it warned that the plant could be overrun by a tsunami long before the accident, and yet they didn't take any efforts to shore things up, make structural changes. Do they have perception problems, and is that, and how do you build up the confidence in the general public?
That's actually very difficult, and TEPCO was not trusted overall, and then it's kind of typical de facto government-sponsored enterprise. So perception problem already existed even before nuclear disaster. And then a nuclear disaster occurred. And then, you know, by the way, the kind of report that you mentioned existed like everywhere. And then like very few times government picked it up. That's actually what history tells. And then this is not just Japanese government. Any government, right? Government is very slow to respond to the warning sign provided by various actors, scientists sometimes, and then other actors. So that's not surprising. And then so the perception issue, trust issue exists. But at the same time, to me, it seems that if you are in the position of the Japanese government, I cannot think of any better way. So as other commentators said, there are some better ways, but at the same time, it's more expensive. And then to convince the government to take that measure would be, I would say, very difficult.
Sweta, talk to us about the trust issues. And you know, Changhua Wu was talking about, you know, the Greenpeace has thrown out some other options. Is this really the only option they have?
Yeah, I mean, I'm open to the solutions. If there's a better solution, there's no reason we shouldn't put it forward. But the reason that this is getting so much pushback, again, it's not because of the safety, it's because of the distrust in the government and the poor communication from the beginning that occurred. And what we need to improve on trust is transparency and effective two-way engagement with all stakeholders, including the fishermen, including the different environmental groups. This is something that has been sorely lacking, not just related to nuclear energy and its potential and promise, but generally when we are seeing these kinds of difficult risk perceptions that are occurring that don't match up to the reality of the risk that's actually there. So this is an entire field of science behind the science of engagement and communication that is always sorely missing.
Changhua Wu, it's interesting because China says the Pacific Ocean is mankind's shared property. And you know, in terms of outreach to neighbors like South Korea and China, obviously we've touched on this, Japan has not done a great job. Is there something they can do to get more buy-in from neighbors?
Well, at least they should have started the process, right? Rather than just being transparent, or you know, to the U.S. government, the Japanese government should have been more transparent to, of course, not only just South Korea and China, but also, you know, the broader regional key players, national governments, NGOs, the scientific community, even to the international community. If that had happened, probably today we would be dealing with a very different situation. But unfortunately, this case had happened, which already created a tremendous lack of trust and lack of credibility on the Japanese side. And I do not see a magic solution or way out at this moment, but at least the bottom line, a process needs to be started as soon as possible to have a broader consultation with all the key stake players together. You know, everyone, multilateral, bilateral, regional, NGO, government, even private sector together, and to find better solutions there. I cannot single out one single best solution to get everything addressed at this moment, but at least the process will be very critical at this moment.
Eunjung, relations between Japan and its neighbors, not great right now. This isn't making things any better. What would you say Japan could do to make better with its neighbors?
I will definitely I would like to suggest to the Japanese government, again, to bring in, as other panelists also mentioned, to bring in the stakeholder, including Korea, China, even Taiwan, Philippines, Vietnam, or how about Australia or New Zealand, you know, broader regions, all this, you know, we share the ocean and we share the air. So I hope they can can show some good manners, again, to respect others' concerns at least. And I hope I can hear more like a full, sincere explanations about the process and about the data and the schedule that they are planning. So, that kind of, again, the communication, without the communication and the dialogues, all this perception issue will be escalating unnecessarily. So again, I'd like to see that they can restore the conversations.
Hiroki, instead of patching things up with his neighbors, he's coming here to Washington, D.C. Prime Minister Suga will be here tomorrow, meet with President Biden. Da Jizhong, who's with the Heilongjiang Provisional Academy of Sciences, believes the U.S. support of Japan's plan is a political deal in exchange for Japan's closer strategic support. What do you make of that charge?
Probably that's the case. And I think that from the U.S. perspective, U.S. doesn't have many interest in being involved in this issue because actually U.S. is very far from Japan in terms of the, the distance. So that's why U.S. U.S. makes the decision only depending on political concerns. So from U.S. perspective, I think they don't want to deal with this issue so much, and then so try to get rid of this issue from the table as soon as possible, and then start talking about what they think more important.
Changhua Wu, I'm going to save the last question for you. I interviewed you in Beijing a couple years ago. I know you talk to people there all the time. What are you hearing from them? Because I imagine the question is, are people going to be comfortable eating the seafood, the fish, whether or not there are all these claims that it's safe? What are you hearing from your friends back there?
The short answer is no. I think 10 years ago, more than 10 years ago, when the disaster occurred, China has already banned importing Japanese seafood already. And that's still ongoing. And back in 2018, Chinese universities academic study also found in the East China Sea also much increased concentration level of cesium in the fish stock there already. So further enhances the alert on the Chinese consumer side. I just want to add another note with the Japanese, Prime Minister visiting Washington this week. Unfortunately, U.S. priority is really to bring its allies together to confront China. And this is being turned into another situation, unfortunately. And I hope all countries will be able to show up their responsibility and behave and walk the walk, actually, and not only just talk the talk, to really protect, in this particular case, the ecosystem sustainability, the health and the safety of the Pacific Ocean, which is a shared asset of global community.
And we're going to leave it there. Thank you all for joining us. That's it for this edition of The Heat. I'm Mike Walter in Washington, D.C. Thanks for watching.